Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, everyone. Ryan here. Today we're going to be checking out Mercuriall's solution to all of your brown sound and plexitone needs with a VST plugin called Spark. Though we've already looked at Reaccess and a handful of their free offerings, Spark was actually the way I got introduced to Mercuriall, and I was very impressed when I first heard it. Still am, obviously, with being such a small team and the updates keep rolling out. So Spark is the Marshall-based sound. It's where you're going to get your JCM 800 and your old school plexitones. Now, it comes to the whole amp debate, 5150s, orange, Ingle, all that good stuff. Generally, I default to the Mesa stuff, obviously, which is why I enjoyed Reaccess so much. And the Tri-Axis has so many iconic Mesa preamp sounds built into it as is, and plus the plugin is just a really amazing suite. So it's going to be hard to follow that one up, especially considering that it is a bit more fleshed out than Spark, but Spark definitely has its use cases. And I love some good old plexitones, obviously being a Tony Iommi fan, though he's a Laney user, they're pretty much Marshall clones. Being Zach Wild fan, so many of these iconic guitarists that I love growing up, that's the tones they used were based off of old school Marshalls or JCM 800s, those sort of things. So definitely has its use case for me. With that said, the palette of tones and presets I'll be sharing in this video isn't exactly par for the course for me. It'll be a little bit more on the classic side compared to the heavier stuff I normally do, though we'll certainly be looking at some supercharged Marshall sounds. This plugin I feel is really good for the classic rock fan trying to sound like Clapton or Jimmy Page. I think that fits right up your alley all the way through some hair metal stuff. And there is a Guns N' Roses Appetite for Destruction model on here for those of you that enjoy that sound. So we'll definitely be looking at that as well. And without further ado, let's get into some Spark. So if I recall correctly, Spark was the first of Mercuriall's premium plugins to release, which is why that compared to Reaccess, this may seem a little bare bones or a little bit in progress as far as the build goes. It is a finished product and works great. I think it looks just fine, but you're not going to get as many of the graphical options as you would in Reaccess. For instance, we do have a noise gate and stop box plugin like you do on Reaccess, but you don't get to see a graphical representation of it, but you should be familiar with what they are by now anyway. So going through, we'll just we'll hit every portion of this and then demo some tones. So you have 4 different amp models to choose from: Bass 67, Lead 68. So these are kind of your old school JMP amps. The 800, the JCM 800, and the Appetite for Destruction model. And this one even has a really cool number 34 Jose, whatever his name, mod is. These are graphically represented a little bit. So you can kind of see the old school face versus the newer version. Same thing here, but that's pretty much the extent of the graphical changes. Up here you have your speaker section as well as power amp and some pre-amp plugins. So you got a noise gate, which works pretty much the same as Reaccess does. You have a selection out of 5 stomp boxes for overdrive pedals. Here I'm using the standard Tube Screamer. There's the same Tube Screamer lower output, lower gain mod that I really like. There's the TS7, which is higher gain. Grid Slammer, which is Mesa Boogie's asymmetrical take on the 808, kind of somewhere between the 808 and the Boss Super Overdrive. And then there is the Boss Super Overdrive here. So got plenty of the clipping diode pedals if that's what you're into. One thing I would love to see, because I did try it out with a third-party plugin, is a Treble Booster on here. Not just because I'm a Sabbath fan, but because I feel like it really works well with a lot of these model of amps. On all these models, you have 2 channels to choose from, although I'll be mainly demoing the first channel. Particularly on these vintage amps, the second channel is a lot bassier. It's kind of your normal drive compared to the treble drive I'm using here, and I find that treble boosters really work great to cut through that and get some vintage tones out of. Now, being a Sabbath fan, Tony Iommi actually had his treble booster modified to be more of a full range booster, which is why the lower gain 808 mod works just fine for this application, but I feel like that would be a really cool addition if that could be added at some point. Moving on to the speaker selection, you have the same 4 models that are found in Reaxis. T75s work great for more modern material. V30s are my personal favorite. G12s are what I generally gravitate towards for Marshall stuff, and K120s are in here as well as their pre-EQ'd versions if you don't want to have to mess with that and let it sit in the mix quite a bit better. You got the Shure SM57, Royer 121, and Sennheiser MD441 microphones. I find the Sennheiser works great for the first 2 amps here. Get a very vintage sound out of it. Unfortunately, unlike Reaxis, you can't add your own impulse response in cabinet form nor reverb form into the plugin itself. Of course, you would always add another plugin afterwards, but it's not quite the self-contained unit that Reaxis is. But it's just something that they learned over the course of making these plugins. And then on this screen, finally, you can choose different preamp power tubes, oversampling, all that good stuff, input and output. Mostly be using EL34s here, minus, I think, 1 demo Marshalls. You got to use EL34s. We also have an effects screen, which have pretty much the same great effects that are in Reaxis. I can't remember if all the parameters are in here or not, but it works really well. The chorus is great. I'm fairly certain this is the same chorus that they now have in free VST plugin mode. I've not demoed it personally, but I've seen some videos of it, and it sounds really, really good. So I would definitely check that out. I use this pretty much in all of these to make it wider sounding, and here it is kind of more of a regular chorus effect, kind of a modulation deal, but this works great as a stereoizer. Reverb, all these models sound great. Spring and is probably my favorite for more traditional classic tones, and then reverb, which you can put parallel or prior to, or I mean delay that you can put parallel or prior to the reverb, give you a couple different delay effects, whether it bounces further on the left or right, or you get a more center channel effect. So that's the layout of Spark in general. So now let's go over a couple demos of each of the amp models and the setups that I have. So I'm going to load the first preset, which should be mostly the same. Yeah, okay. So this first preset is kind of a rockabilly setup, lower gain using the first channel. I'm playing my Fender Telecaster on the single coil mode, split coil on the bridge, and this is what it sounds like. I love a good compressed Fender tweed tone for classic country as much as the next guy, but I find that a lot of the vintage Marshall circuits that are based off of Fender Bassmans, like this one, work even better in some ways. I feel like it kind of has a natural compression. You don't need as much of a line driver or a clean boost, although I am using one here. It's set fairly tame, so you could probably crank the gain and not really need it here. Another interesting thing about these models that are definitely true to life about the older amps is that don't be afraid to play with the EQ. You know, modern amps are a lot of the times voiced at noon or the 5 setting here, and that's kind of the stock sound, and they like to leverage that, to make it different sounding. But a lot of the times with these older amps, the effect of going from 0 to 10 may not even be as much as going from, say, 3 to 6 on a normal amp. So don't be afraid to crank it and listen to what sounds good, because here I have the treble all the way up, which is definitely not what you would do on most modern amps today. Same with bass. Presence is a bit more sensitive, I find, on these vintage models, but it works
kind of the same. So yeah, it's kind of a classic take on it. You could go to the second channel and get a little bit more woofiness out of it, but I really like this setup here. Track 2 is kind of the classic rock setup. I'm using the TS808 mod, the lower gain mod, to kind of act as a wider range booster. The Lead 68 model, which actually trying to emulate a Laney supergroup and not even a Marshall, but it was pretty much Marshall clone, so, you know, same deal. Again, you'll kind of see a funny setup on this one. I'm chasing the Sabbath Bloody Sabbath tone, or at least approximating it. So I'm using 2 Sennheiser mics, which isn't normally what I would do, but kind of have them in 2 different positions just to try to get that honky weird tone. And because of that, I have a pre-EQ to give a bit of the wah half-cocked sound that was present on a lot of those songs. So this is what that sounds like. I'm sure you could hear I applied generous amounts of chorus and reverb, kind of give that spacey feel that that record had in particular. What I really like about this model, and all of them, but it's especially pertinent on the more vintage models, is how accurately the master volume reacts here. So, you know, turning up the volume of the amp actually affected the gain a lot. If I were to half this, and I'll let you hear it in a second, the gain structure changes dramatically. You lose a lot of the mids and just becomes more shrill. So it's kind of cool that you can get the old school Marshall, you know, cranked all the way up, Brown sound or you know, Sabbath AC/DC sound by doing that. Quite the dramatic difference, as you can hear, and something that's definitely important to emulating these amps. So I was very happy to see that. A lot of VSTs, especially the free ones, kind of miss that. The volume control is generally just level, but this one works really well. So you kind of have almost 2 gain controls to balance, but it's pretty cool. So the next one here we're going to look at is a supercharged Marshall JCM 800, and for here, I was going for more of the Zakk Wylde sound, and it works pretty well. So using the Boss Super Overdrive model, got drive a little bit higher than, you know, normally I would do the kind of quintessential modern tube screamer setup, no drive, 10 tone, 10 level, but for Zakk stuff, it's a little bit more traditional. So we got a little bit of drive, tones at 12 o'clock. You can move it up a little bit depending on your guitar, and level I've got at 7. Obviously using the JCM 800, gain is cranked. I have the master volume set at about noon. This was definitely a bit harder to balance for the gain, and the master volume on this model really affects the mids a lot. So that's kind of where I landed here. Bass, middle, and treble. Treble 10, mid at 2. Zakk Wylde's definitely kind of that stereotypical cut all the mids, but that works for Marshall amps. You can't do that on Mesas and 5150s, and that, well, 5150s a little bit, but for this you can definitely get away with it. Quite a bit of bass, not a whole lot of presence. Using still the G12s, of course. Zakk uses electro voice speakers. That would be a really cool impulse response. A lot of lower gain players are fond of them, and I can't even name a single impulse response pack that isn't premium that even has them. I think there's a couple in the Axe Effects, but yeah, so that'd be a pretty cool one. But yeah, everything else is fairly stock. Again, using the chorus as a kind of a stereoizer, no other effects. Got the noise gate on for this round, and using my Wild Audio Blood Eagle with EMG 81 in the bridge, and you get this. .2203s and JCM 800s are no doubt most associated with 80s metal, thrash metal, hair metal, that kind of stuff, for good reason. But you throw a higher gain overdrive pedal in front of it, and it works just fine for modern stuff as well. If you're looking for that type of tone, Black Label Society, Nile is another really good example of high gain Marshall sounds. Of course, they use all kinds of stuff, Engel Invaders, Bogner, Uberschalls, Splons, but they're all based off of this kind of sound. So you can definitely get it out of here. So don't be discouraged if you're a high gain metal player. There's definitely use in here. A lot of Mike Fortin sounds are based off of classic Marshalls that have been frequency modified. So if you play with, say, a clean boost in front of this, definitely usable for that. Lastly, we will look at this AFD model, which is based off of Slash's modified Marshall used on Appetite for Destruction. It's kind of his whole signature tone. Not gonna lie, I am not really a fan of Guns N' Roses in the least, but his tone on that album was definitely iconic, and it's a great sounding Marshall as far as I'm concerned. So this amp has a pretty cool thing. So this is the number 34 mod. There's actually a model of this in the Axe-Fx Fractal Audio firmware as well. It's one of those things that you definitely see its use, but it adds a whole lot of upper presence and treble and kind of this sound that it gets hard to tame real quick if you are trying to set it up as you would a normal amp. So I don't have that engaged, but it's still a very nice mix between kind of a more modern scoop sound and that classic Marshall vibe. I have this set up as kind of my more regular rock sound, somewhere between a normal Marshall JCM 800 sound to a scoop dual rectifier, which is why the EQ is set up a bit more traditionally, except for treble. This amp has a lot of high end to tame, so that's why that's in presence turned down quite a bit, as well as the tone on the Grid Slammer boost I'm using. You just don't need it as much as a lot of other amps. The noise gate is active. We're using my favorite V30 speakers with a blend of the SM57 and the MD441, which is pretty much what I actually use for my impulse responses that I use daily, and using the 606 power amp. That's the only thing I changed here, and this is what it sounds like. If you're a GNR fan or just like the 34 mod, I think this is a pretty accurate representation of it. I have no personal experience with it, but hearing the tones of the real amp and playing with the fractal model, I'd say this is really, really close. So here I'm going to turn off the drive pedals entirely, change the EQ and the master volume here and the gain, because you pretty much have to change everything on this amp to get it to play nice, but this is what the 34 does. With the right guitar, you really don't even need an overdrive pedal with this. I think something with a bit more high output than I'm using here would really suit this. I'm using the SG with 61 paths on it, so it's you know, not quite up to the task, I think, of filling out the gain I'd want for this. But yeah, even a clean boost, I think would do the job. So this is a pretty cool toggle switch. It's definitely a standout from a lot of other plugins. So my overall impressions of Spark, I think it's really, really good. I don't think it's quite the value of Reaxis, especially when Reaxis was on sale. That was just as ridiculous. I would have definitely bought it at that point. And you can kind of tell this was, you know, came before, and I think I did myself a bit of a disservice by looking at this one after Reaxis, but I just wanted to get to Reaxis really badly. But I will definitely say that the most unique feature of this is the 4 amp models. Obviously, they have their own JCM 800 emulation that you can kind of get for free, so that's already out there. But finding a good vintage Plexi plugin is a lot harder than you would think it would be. Everyone has, you know, dual rectifiers of 5150 plugins out the wazoo, but just finding something that works well for classic Zeppelin, Sabbath, you know, whatever tones you're chasing from that era, not an easy feat. So it's really nice that there is something out there that, you know, in a bit more premium space that feeds that, or that fills that void there. And then, of course, the Appetite for Destruction model is really great. There is a free plugin out there. I'm pretty sure Mars by what's his name? I'll never be able to remember it. Dmitry something, if I remember correctly, is a Russian guy that makes all kinds of free stuff, and it's definitely a valiant effort. It sounds pretty good, but I do think this one rounds it out quite a bit better. An update, I think, would really service this with the same UI or more similar UI compared to Reaxis, where you got kind of the visual of having all the pedals there, just to kind of tie it together, make it you know, an obvious, oh, this comes from the same you know, the same developer, which to me it's obvious. You've got the same speaker selection, and it says Mercurial, but you know, just thoughts there. But everything else, I think it's a solid package. If you need a good convincing plugin for Marshall sounds ranging from the 60s to now, I think this works really well. Again, a couple tweaks to UI, an update or two maybe to bring in even another amp model at some point. I think this covers most of the bases, but something a bit more modern sounding might work. Just thoughts, but I think it's a really good value, just compared to coming from Reaxis. Maybe not as much, but definitely a fan of this, and I'd have no qualms about recommending this to someone who needs a Marshall sound in VST form. And with that, we will call it a video. Thank you for sticking around and watching. Huge thanks to Mercurial once again, specifically Slava, for hooking me up with these free plugins. I had a lot of fun jamming around on this, and Reaxis, I have every intention to make at least one cover with one of these plugins, and we have one more to check out, so hopefully that'll be in a few weeks or so. With that, we will see you next time. Bye.